Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Secret Origins of Mint Condition. I am one of your hosts, James, and with me is Joe.
Hello, folks.
And Chris.
Hey, y'all.
And joining us on this episode today is friend of the show, repeat guest, Mint Hall of Fame legend, and our resident professor, Jack Adrien is here.
Here. Yeah.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the very gracious welcome.
You've proven it over 10 times over, so you know.
Yeah, great to be back. Great to be back. As long as you'll have me. Thank you.
Yes, of course. We'll always be welcome to have you on the show. And today we are going to dive back into something that if you have not gone back and listened to Jack's origin episode, please do. We're going to talk about a comic that was near and dear to his heart that got him into collecting, and that is the Legion of Superheroes. So I'm going to admit right away that the only Legion book I have ever read is Legion Lost, which I read that 12 or 16 issue series. So I'm here to learn today. Jack, I guess why don't you kick us off and maybe just reiterate what was it about the Legion that got you into it, and then maybe explain who the Legion are to everyone listening.
Wonderful, thank you, James. So have a flashback. As I indicated in my first episode to this esteemed forum, Legion of Superheroes, when my brother and I were young, our uncle used to buy us comic books. And so the comic book that he would buy me is the Legion of Superheroes, and the comic he bought my brother was Warlord, Travis Morgan, Warlord. And so obviously one had more staying power than the other. You can guess which. And I was always fascinated with the Legion, and the thing that I loved most about them, with respect to the nature of the characters, is they are a collection of superheroes. But the whole idea behind them is that technically they're people with superpowers. And the reason why I want to make that distinction is because the comic book is set originally in the 30th century, and then they moved it to the 31st century, obviously with the changing of our century from the 20th to the 21st. It's set 1,000 years in the future is the easiest way to think about it. And in 1,000 years, humans have kind of gone to many different planets, terraformed them just by the nature of the planets. Many of them kind of developed unique abilities, and then those unique abilities make them stand apart from the terrestrial humans. And so, as I indicated, they are humans for the most part with superpowers or extraordinary abilities, but on the planets from where they're from, they are actually just normal people. Key distinction is most often the members of the Legion are the people who either wanted to leave the planet. They typically write in the stories that the planets tend to be very xenophobic, tend not to want to leave, or they were people who actually were the best and had the highest performance or the highest level of that ability on the planet. And so one of the characters, Cosmic Boy, has magnetic powers. And so he was the champion of a game called Magna Ball. And so he was essentially considered the best person with magnetism on the planet. And then again, you always have your unique situations where you have individuals who either had a freak accident and developed their powers that way, or have somehow developed their powers in some other means or shape or fashion. They have people from other dimensions. And so I always loved the stories because, again, it was kind of a superhero United Nations. You had all of these individuals who were banded together to do good. And they work together to help. It's always a little unclear whether it's the galaxy or the universe or how far it extends. They were gathered together to help all of the planets. In the I think it was called the organization. It's not the Federation like it is
United Planets.
United Planets. I'm pretty sure that's what I thought it was, the United Planets. And again, at this point, it's a United Earth, so it's one Earth government. And so they were started. They were inspired by Superboy. Just to give you a little history, that the actual comic started in Adventure Comics number 247, April 1958. And so for those who are recent arrivals to comics, Superman essentially started it as a character, but in their interest to kind of diversify the stories, many writers said, well, what happened when Superman was a boy? What happened when Superman was a teenager? And so there were kind of these varying different stories about Superman's early life. And so the Legion of Superheroes as an idea was inspired by Superman's adventures as a teenager when he was Superboy. And so they used that to inspire them 1,000 years in the future. So they traveled back in the past to actually meet Superboy and actually invite him to participate in, become a member of the Legion. And Joe, I'm sure you've read this comic. Please jump in and tell me, my recollection may be faulty, but I'd love to hear your take on Superboy's introduction to the Legion of Superheroes.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think at the time, it was 1958, as you said. Mort Weisinger was then ascended to the editor of all the Superman magazines. He had just come off a stint in Hollywood as the story editor for the Adventures of Superman. And he moved back to New York and he got a promotion. And they gave him all the Superman-related books, which were a lot back in those days, including Lois Lane and Jimmy Olsen. And I think they needed, like you said, they wanted to flesh out Superman's boyhood. And Superboy had been in the comics for a while now, but they wanted to give him a quote-unquote some super friends. And hence the Legion of Superheroes is born. I mean, the first story was written by Otto Binder, and Al Plastino was the artist. And that's, that is the only of all the Silver Age, Modern Age, Bronze Age, whatever age you want to call it, the only Legion of Superheroes book I do not have in my collection is Adventure Comics 247 because it's too expensive.
Whoa!
Yeah, otherwise I've got every appearance. And to me, the Legion, it spoke to me. And we've spoken about this before in previous podcasts, but a collection of superheroes that were teenagers. And unlike my brother and his friends, they weren't dicks. So they were cool. They were cool guys and girls that didn't push 10-year-old boys.
Concisely put, Joe.
You're welcome. They didn't push 10-year-old boys around and steal their lunch money or their stickball bat money. So we didn't so they were cool teenagers. And they were written by a teenager by the time we got to the late 60s or the middle 60s by 13, 14-year-old Jim Shooter, who sent in his pencils and script to still then Mort Weisinger, the editor. So it's just a great history and a great tapestry of how this group came together and became such a gigantic part of the Superman, Superboy mythos. As a kid, when I read my first two issues were 346 and 347, where they introduced Karate Kid, Princess Projector, Feral Lad, and Nemesis Kid. And one of them was a spy. And there's all this far-flung, colorful stuff going on, far-flung future with all this, with some mystery intrigue. And I said to myself as a 10-year-old, this is going to be my comic book. And it always has been. Yeah.
Wow. That's
Long live the
fantastic.
Legion.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. I mean, well, before we go deeper, Chris, do you have familiarity with this book? Maybe I'm the only one here who hasn't really read anything except that one series.
No, I mean, I'm right there with you, James. I'm here for an education. My experience with the Legion is extremely limited, and that's to the animated stuff. It's limited to, they had a brief appearance in Superman the animated series. They show up in I think it's in Batman Beyond. They show up. They show up in Young Justice, in the latest season of Young Justice. So my experience with Legion is very, very limited to the animated materials.
Yeah, so I guess since Chris and I are here to learn, and the only other, aside from Legion Lost, the only other exposure I've had to them is the character, a few appearances that Chris has mentioned in the Justice League cartoon and Batman Beyond, and then obviously the few characters they pulled into Supergirl on CW was my exposure to them. So I guess take us, who are the, I guess, I know there's been many incarnations since the 50s, but who are the primary cast of Legion heroes that we're always going to be following?
Go ahead, Jack.
So, yeah, that's a great question. So, very similar to how the DC has, the Trinity, Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman, and one could even argue Marvel has the Trinity, Captain America, Iron Man, and Thor.
Right.
The Trinity for the Legion of Superheroes has historically and in most iterations been Satin Girl, Cosmic Boy, and Lightning Lad.
Right.
And so they were the first characters introduced. That issue where the introduction with Superboy in Adventure Comics 247. And so they explained to Superboy at the time that there were larger, heroes. And so that I don't think those heroes were actually introduced in that particular issue, but those are the Legion members that you typically saw. And even in, if memory serves, in Superboy, those were the characters that were introduced. And so for the most part, when you're introduced to the Legion of Superheroes, either in comic books or even in other media, you typically start with either one or all of those characters as being kind of the landmark characters of the series, and so they're the ones who represent the Legion of Superheroes. And just to give some background, because other than Lightning Boy, the names may not necessarily be very indicative of what their powers are. Lightning Boy, I think so, intuitive. Satin Girl, she has telepathy,
Mhm.
and her power of telepathy very similar to Professor X insofar as she can read minds and project thoughts into other people's minds. For the most part, I think they kind of shy away from whether or not she can control other people. I think maybe some writers have kind of adopted that, but that's typically not been kind of the focus of the character. In Cosmic Boy, as I indicated, he's from the planet Braille, Braal. And he has magnetism, the power of magnetism, which is natural for all the Brillians of his species. Again, the very idea was it developed, they evolved the power of magnetism to defend themselves against the metallic creatures that threatened them on the planet.
Right.
So obviously, whoever wrote that has no idea how evolution works. But, it makes for good stories. And so those are the key characters. But from there, other characters have kind of evolved. And so, in subsequent appearances, the other characters who were essentially become more well known, and I think they were first introduced in the Encore in Adventure Comics number 267, they would include Chameleon Boy, who.
Oh, that's what I was gonna name. I was gonna ask about Chameleon Boy.
Yes, exactly. Chameleon Boy, Invisible Kid. I think eponymously named Invisible Kid. Colossal Boy. Again, I think that one says it all. Starboy. Very unique situation with Starboy. He's had two separate sets of powers. I think his original introduction was that he had powers, and I forget which way the powers went. He had powers similar to Superboy, but then he developed powers of essentially imbuing something with the mass and the gravity of a star.
Yes.
So he can make things really heavy. Brainiac 5, he has I think it's a level 13th intellect. And they actually qualify, how each level works. And so I think with the level 13, he's named Brainiac 5 because there were 4 subsequent Brainiacs. And the first of which is being Brainiac. His ancestor is Brainiac 1, Superman's, Rogues Gallery villain. And so they created a whole backstory for him. But his level of intellect is he has the intellect of an entire solar system. So he's got that much brain power. Triplicate Girl, she can split herself into 3. Shrinking Violets, I think that one says it all as well.
Right.
Sun Boy, heat and light powers. Bouncing Boy, ironically, just what you expect. Phantom Girl, she can phase through things like a ghost. The unique thing about her is she actually comes from a different dimension. Her powers are normal for everyone from her dimension.
I actually have a question about her, if I may interject for a quick second. I'm curious because, and this is a little bit spoilery, so for anybody
I know where this is going.
Okay, is she from the Phantom Dimension, the Phantom Zone?
No.
Okay. Because
strictly speaking, no. So she's from a planet called Bitskill, because I think it's BZGL or.
Yeah, I can never pronounce that.
Yeah, never could I. So
sounds
imagination.
like Mitziel Spitlick.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. And so it's in a pocket universe or a pocket dimension that adjoins Earth, and so she can cross over. I do know in some, and again, not to give too many spoilers, but in some recent iterations, the character has been reintroduced as coming from the Phantom Zone. I think that's a great interpretation, and I like what I've seen how they've done that.
Okay.
But as the character originally was created and how the character evolved, that's not specifically how the writers intended for it to be.
Okay, nope, that's good to know. Thank you, appreciate you.
Well, I guess some of I'm familiar with some of those characters. I guess the one you haven't named, and the one I guess I know is like Mon-el. Where did Mon-el come from?
There's just 2 other characters that I want to introduce before we get to Mon-el. So Ultra Boy is another kind of legacy character. And again, he has Superman-like powers, but he can only use one at a time.
One at a time, right?
And so on some level, he was kind of useless. They used to have jetpacks, and so that handled the flying situation. But once they had the Legion flight ring, then essentially he always had the ability to fly without sacrificing another power. And I only say that insofar as it's a cool power, other than if you need to do 2 things at once. Wildfire is a very popular character.
Yes.
So many people who are Legion fans are familiar with him because he has his body is transformed into a nuclear reactor, and he wears a containment suit, and he has a tragic love story with Dawnstar. I felt that he's an important character to kind of introduced, because I know many people are kind of familiar with him just because he's a fan favorite.
He sounds like Chamber from Generation X.
Yes,
Yes.
yes, yes, and some might even argue probably lifted directly as far as the whole notion. But yes, yes. Whereas Chamber is psionic, he is nuclear fire and energy.
Right.
But Mon-el. So I'm going to defer on Mon-el to Joe, because I think Joe has great familiarity, because Mon-el is actually a character that started in Superboy. Take it
That's
away,
right.
Joe.
Mon-el's first appearance is Superboy number 89, June 1961. Superboy's big brother, written by Robert Bernstein, who was one of the many writers in the Weisinger stable of Superman books, penciled by George Papp, who made his bones and made his name known in the 40s by penciling the Green Arrow series in More Fun Comics. Mon-el, we were told, I have the book here. It's right here, some in front of me, I think. I pulled all this stuff out, but I can't even find it right now. Mon-el was... Superboy thought that this guy was actually from Krypton. He was his big brother. And there's this whole convoluted story that goes on that proves he's not, obviously. But then all of a sudden, Mon-el just kind of keels over at the end of the story. And we find out that he's allergic to lead, that people from Daxam cannot leave their planet. They're literally hostages on their planet because lead's everywhere in the universe. And it's dangerous to them outside their own environment. So what does Mon-el happen? What does Superboy do with him? He puts her in the Phantom Zone, and he stays there for 1,000 years until we get to Adventure Comics 300, which is the first issue of that gives the Legion their own title, 1962. And Saturn Girl, in a story entitled, let's see now, Secret of the, is that Secret of the Mystery Legionnaire? Or am I thinking of something else? Yeah. Yes. No, that's a different story. I'm sorry, guys. But Saturn Girl invents a serum that can let him out of the Phantom Zone, but and help him defeat a robotic Lex Luthor of all things. It doesn't work. He's got to go back in, and then about 3 or 4 issues later, finally Brainiac 5 comes up with a permanent serum that he has to take regularly, not to be overcome by the lead that's everywhere in the universe. So Mon-el has all the powers of Superboy, and now that he's not vulnerable to lead, he's considered the most powerful Legionnaire because he doesn't have any weakness like kryptonite, although Mon-el is vulnerable to magic, as are all these characters. So that's briefly the story of Mon-el, who gets later on after, what is it, Jack? Is it after, what's the story where the timeline story in the 90s where things go haywire?
Zero Hour? I remember it. Yeah. It had Extant in it, was it? Was it Zero Hour? I think it was.
Then Mon-el becomes Valor at some point, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, because they
and I actually I bought that comic, and I thought it was a really good. James, to your point, they essentially tied Mon-el back into the founding of all of these other planets from which the Legion come from.
Yes.
So they did what's called a retcon to our listeners. You reimagine a storyline, and so he was in the present. The present of that time, and then this was before he was running out of time because of the lead poisoning, so he only had a certain amount of time, and so he became this galactic hero to actually become the founder and seed many of these different planets with human populations. And the reason why they needed to do that is because after John Byrne came out with Man of Steel, there was no Superboy to inspire the Legion.
Pocket universe.
So they then needed someone who could serve that role. So since Mon-el was introduced into the comic book as part of the Superman family, they thought it was a great idea, and I think it was well handled, for him essentially to then become the inspiration for the Legion.
And actually, Jack, I'm sorry, James, but that was actually, there was a story back in the 60s written by Jim Shooter where Superman goes 1,000 years plus into the future and meets the Legion, the adult Legion of superheroes. And we find out that some are dead, some are married, some have left, whatever. And we find out that Mon-el, who's now a grown man, is doing exactly what Jack said, exploring the universe, taking on that role. So that was kind of preordained from way back in the late 60s.
Oh, that's good to know. I love that there are some storylines which are just kind of reimagined or reinterpreted.
Yeah.
I think creators do a better job now of, providing the inspiration for, the source material. I don't necessarily think they were as concerned about that back in the day.
No, they weren't. No, they just wanted to get from issue to issue. But Jim Shooter was one of the first writers at DC Comics that actually started bringing continuity and through lines and subplots into the book. You get a one and done or a two-parter, but something that happened in a two-parter may get called on again, or paid off 2 or 3 issues down the road. And so he was one of the very first people to do that. Otherwise, everything was one and done. It wasn't until Denny O'Neil started writing regularly for DC that you got continued stories and subplots.
Well, this could be my ignorance of when I really got into comic books, and just because of what I was exposed to and being at Mint. But why are the Legion not a bigger? Why don't I know about? Why do Chris and I not know about the Legion? Like, I know like they were there obviously, but in terms of books we gravitated towards or characters that I was exposed to, I don't feel like the Legion came up that much, especially when I was collecting in the 90s through the 2000s. Or Chris, maybe you have something to say on this too.
Yeah, I can tell you exactly why. For me personally, why it didn't show up for me, and that's because it's twofold. One is that the universe for Legion didn't really expand very far when I was at the time that I was reading. Right, there was just the Legion of Superheroes comic book, and that was it. So there was no expansion into other worlds. They were very rarely did I find them featured in a book, and then I'd find myself being told, hey, if you want to continue this story arc, go to Legion, whatever, go to this issue. There was never a far-reaching event. They sort of never reached out beyond their own storylines, and I think that was always sort of a mistake, because that's how DC has always sold other books, right? When they want you to read a new book, when they want you to read Quiver, they mention the events of Quiver in other books, right? So they didn't really, in the time that I was reading in the late 90s, in the 90s and the early 2000s, they didn't do any of that. So they were not made higher profile, and so as a result, I just never saw them. But also, by the time that I was reading comic books, I was at an age where certain superhero names were a turnoff to me because they felt like they were not creative. And if you list all the names if you relist all the names that Jack has already listed, those names don't feel or sound creative or really even that interesting. When you have superheroes like the Martian Manhunter, who can turn invisible and shapeshift and phase and be telepathic, like why would I read about a superhero who can do one of those things, or 4 superheroes who combined can do those things, when I've got one superhero that can do all the things? So I don't know if that resonates with anybody, but that was my personal experience.
No, that's a fair point, Chris, from my point of view, because like I read Legion Lost only because I think maybe Steve or Richie said you got to read this, and it was a very intriguing story.
That was a great story.
And it was the Legion, but they were trapped basically in the Delta Quadrant, trying to get home. So it was basically Star Trek Voyager with the Legion of Superheroes, if I remember correctly. It's been a long time since I read that.
Honestly, by the time I got to Legion, or by the time that I was aware of comics, I did not know the history of Legion. So it was easy for me to look at Legion and think it was derivative, even though that is not actually the case based on the history that Joe and Jack are so kindly sharing with us. But when you don't know where it came from, it's easy to look at it and go, man, what a cheap or what a dumb knockoff. I don't understand. Why would they bother? They're taking these heroes and setting it in the future. What's interesting about that?
Yeah, I mean, the way you guys describe it, Joe and Jack, is they're almost, to me, they sound like they could have been the X-Men of the future, the space X-Men of the future. But I think it's to Chris's point. Yeah, I was not exposed to the Legion except someone telling me to read that miniseries that came out in the early 2000s or late 90s, early 2000s. But maybe now I'll open up to you and Jack now. What do you guys think it is that the Legion didn't catch fire like maybe it should have? Or maybe Chris and I are just not seeing it.
No, I have a theory. Do you want to go first, Jack? Because I have a theory.
No. So, I mean, I'll really quickly say, and I think, Chris, you and James raised some really good points. I mean, there's one of the things that I'll say is, and I think it kind of is what it is, as I've indicated, our youngest is into comics now. And so in telling him about why people read comics is, you either like the character or characters, you like the writer or you like the artist. And those are reasons why you continue with a book, or you follow, or you jump on board with one or the other. The Legion, as you indicated, very insular universe. And part of that is because it's 1,000 years in the future. And there weren't other kind of sister books also happening 1,000 years in the future that you can create an entire shared universe with. And so that typically made it, I think, difficult for people to kind of find something else and then work their way to the Legion. But then, unfortunately, for the most part, and this is going to be very arguable. I think they had great writers and great artists throughout their run. They had very few fan favorite writer or artists. And so it was never a
Good point.
situation where you had John Byrne or even to expect a situation where George Perez did maybe a comic here or there with the Legion. He never had like a long run on there. Or I think the book, as Joe indicated, had a long run with Jim Shooter, and then also had an equally long run with Paul Levitz, who are great and I think extraordinary writers.
Right.
They're not necessarily the kind of writers then who I felt were kind of fan favorites that would have drawn or attracted a lot of new readers to actually find out about them. Joe, I don't know if there's anything you'd like to add.
Well, I
Really
think
quickly, I'm sorry, Joe. I want to let you
point.
continue, but really quickly, man, honestly, Jack, that was the reason that we read comics and breaking it down for your youngest like that. I am stunned that I never really thought to like break it down that way when asked the question. But I really appreciate how concise and insightful that was, because that makes a lot of sense, and that is now the answer I'm always going to give when I'm asked. So thanks for that.
No, that's a great reason, Jack, because it's basically who can put fannies in the seats, and Paul Levitz, and after Paul Levitz, Keith Giffen are good solid comic book writers, but they're not they're not Chris Claremont. They weren't Chris Claremont. They weren't Jim Shooter, especially when Jim Shooter goes to Marvel. They weren't Stan Lee or Denny O'Neil or modern day people like Jeff Johns and people like that. But something that Jack hinted to said before about how with the whole Mon-el and how he's his character had to change. This all happened after the first crisis, and after the first crisis, the Legion of Superheroes lost their tether to the DC universe because Superboy doesn't exist. In John Byrne's reimagining, there's no Superboy. So when he does his Legion of Superhero crossover, we find out that all the years that the Legion was traveling back in time to meet Superboy, it was a pocket universe created by the Time Trapper, and it was all this elaborate, trap of the Time Trapper. And at the end of the story, that all kind of goes away. The Legion book continues, but it's not connected to the Superman universe anymore. And DC should have seen that and should have recognized that, given it a greater scope, and it lost their hook, so to speak. Although in the early 80s, the Legion of Superheroes was a top-selling book for DC, and the only book that outsold the Legion on a regular basis in the early 80s was the Wolfman and Perez New Teen Titans. And of course, in the early 80s, you get arguably one of the greatest DC stories of all time in the Legion books, the Great Darkness Saga. So, it had the Legion still into the early 80s had a lot of oomph and a lot of power behind it, but then it just loses it after that. And
I mean,
go ahead.
I guess then I don't understand, because it's always been my experience that when something is working, they tend to milk it, and I think the exception for that, and this is just in my own limited experience, so you all feel free to correct me. The only time I don't see that, the only time that it's exceptional, is when we're talking about a marginalized identity, right? So if we're talking about something like Black Panther, or we're talking about Shang-Chi, or we're talking about Wonder Woman, inevitably there's the argument that, well, that was just the exception. You really can't have a movie that's headed by a female superhero or a Black superhero or whatever. So when we're talking marginalized community, that's when we tend to go, well, yeah, and we ran into this with Shang-Chi and with the comics, right? Was like, well, it's the exception. You can't have a leading guy like that. It's it's why we ended up with it's why Bruce Lee, right, missed out on so many parts that he rightfully should have had.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's not the case with Legion. So I guess my question is, why the heck didn't they just keep trying to milk the thing when it had already proven that it could make them money? Not that we want to see it beaten into the ground like a dead horse, but why was that not the path they chose?
I don't know. What do you think, Jack?
No, I think that's a really good question. So, I mean, I would probably touch on, at least with the storytelling of Legion, on two different layers. And well, before I start that, I'd like to say with Joe, with the Great Darkness Saga, excellent comic storytelling. It introduced Darkseid into the Legion, universe. And I could be wrong, and I probably am. It was one of those, if you take away the Justice League, Justice Society kind of team up situations that, DC would do on a yearly basis, and, the fans can kind of look forward to it. It was one of those early indications of one of these mega events, which have now kind of become the norm in the comic book industry, and you need to have crisis on my Earth, crisis in my bathroom, crisis in my
on the crosstown
automobile.
bus. Yeah.
Exactly.
You can probably pass on some of those books, but I hear what you're saying.
Exactly. Third crisis to the left. So before those kinds of things, or even Marvel is just as guilty, if as doing that as well. Great Darkness Saga represented something in comic storytelling that was incredible, because it essentially called upon all of the Legion of superheroes, and so every single member, all hands on deck.
Everybody's there.
Exactly. All of their allies, anyone who they've ever encountered, stepped up to fight the Great Darkness Saga and battle Darkseid. And so in many ways, I find that was a precursor to many of these kind of mega kind of crossover or bringing everyone together storylines that we've only now maybe perhaps have started to get tired of. But Legion did it early, and Legion did it well. And so I want to just kind of call back to that. But to the other point, so if you take this situation and the idea, Legion started from a perspective of, you're working with Superboy, and so Superboy, and I've heard you guys discussing on the show, and Superboy and Superman as a character is very difficult for people to write. If you then build on that and start 1,000 years in the future, where this is supposed to be everything is better in the future than it is, in the present, it essentially limits your storytelling options. So then, in many ways, it kind of creates the writers essentially did not necessarily have the breadth of storytelling options, I feel, that they could have used or explored when the comic was kind of working its way, probably until maybe around the mid-'80s into the '90s. If you flip then and kind of look at the Legion from a second perspective, and I think in the '90s, comic and storytelling became much more metacognitive in its perspective. The Legion had an opportunity, and to some extent it did, insofar as you could demonstrate, and I think on some level they've done some of this, but not enough and not consistently, and on some level I think Legion Lost was one of the reasons why that was so well appreciated, is even in the future we still wrestle with problems. And the problems are different, maybe the scale and the scope of them are different, but to almost sound paternalistic, the human condition remains the same. And so I think as the book started to evolve, maybe it caught on too late that it could serve as a medium to actually tell relevant stories in the future. And just to, again, great fan of the show, it's, I think, the equivalent of considering Star Trek, the original series, and Star Trek Strange New Worlds in their storytelling. That would probably be, I think, a good way of considering how they could have, the path they could have taken.
Yeah, definitely. And think about this. The Legion was around more than 20 years before they got a book that was entitled Legion of Superheroes. They started in Adventure Comics, then for between 58 and 62, they just made the rounds as guest stars in all the Superman family books. And then Adventure Comics 300, Superboy, featuring the Legion of Superheroes. Then when they get booted out of Adventure Comics, they wind up in the back of Action Comics for a while. Then they get a new home in the Superboy comic, Superboy starring the Legion of Superheroes and ad nauseum. So the poor group never had their own book for 20 years. They've been around. They were popular, but they were always tied to Superboy and Superman and the Superman world in general. So I think once that ends, it's just difficult for them to find their own identity. And as you said, Jack, I mean, I've read a lot of it, almost all their adventures, and they were never a nuanced book. They never dealt with too many of social problems that could be extrapolated into the future the way Star Trek did. It was always a science fiction adventure series, which is, believe me, there's nothing wrong with that, and I love those stories. But the Legion was never the X-Men. It was never, the way the X-Men is a metaphor for disenfranchised people. The Legion was never that, because I guess by the year 30,000 whatever, that's all supposed to disappear, right? Well, we found out that hasn't in some current iterations of the Legion. But had they thrown that into the mix sooner, maybe the books would have found an audience, and they would have survived. But right now there is no Legion book. They just came out of I didn't read it. It was the Justice League versus the Legion of Superheroes, written by Bendis. So I wouldn't even pay a dime for that. So I don't know what's going to happen. Everybody's holding their breath that somehow there'll be a new Legion book, and it might be written by Jeff Johns, although people want him on JSA if you talk to Keith. So we don't know where the Legion is going right now, and if they're even going anywhere with these things.
I mean, not to like Monday morning quarterback for so many years of writing, but like I guess they would have been better served having built out that future universe a little bit more, so that,
Yes,
as
yes,
Chris said, you would have had a more expansive universe to want to dive into Legion, except a sole insular, I guess, title on its own,
yes,
or
yeah.
even when they got the title. And just Chris, I see I know you want to jump in, but I just want to ask, and this is, I don't want to get too sidebarred here, but just for my knowledge, since after Crisis and there was no more Superboy, is the first time we get a Superboy in the Return of Death and Return of Superman with Kurt Connor, like with Connor Kent? Is that the official return of Superboy to the DC universe after Crisis?
Yeah, because right after Crisis, right after that John Byrne storyline with the Pocket Universe, the Pocket Universe Superboy sacrifices himself to save the Legion. So Superboy is then gone from the from DC's current canon. So I think I think Connor Kent might be the next iteration of Superboy.
Oh,
So yeah.
fascinating! Because I don't want to get sidebarred on Superman history, but again, because I didn't really follow Superboy, and since we're talking about him, I didn't realize like he was gone basically from what quote unquote the DC timeline that we knew before the next Crisis came along and wiped all that out. But yeah, I didn't realize that was like the first appearance of Superboy was during the Death and Return of Superman. Chris, I'm sorry, you wanted to ask something.
No. It's fine, James. For anybody who's just joining us, this is our History of Superman episode.
Well, you can't talk about the Legion without talking about Superman.
No, you can't.
You can't.
And to that end, actually, that feels like a good transition into a question that I want to ask, because it sort of drives me nuts. I try not. We've talked on this pod a bunch of times about not judging artists and what their interests are, where they're coming from, the stories they want to tell. If this is your material, then you should tell the story you want to tell, and that's fine. We've said that before, but it feels like a missed opportunity, because dare we envision a future in which DC is finally ready to move on from the heroes and villains they have and move their entire universe into the Legion future, because they always have the option to go back in time and meet some of the heavy hitters from the past. And actually, like, the number of times they've reinvented the DC universe, but it feels like they never thought, you know what, let's move on. And in 15 years, let's go ahead and have something happen with the Legion that's so catastrophic that it actually reinvents some of the past, as long as we're messing with rebooting universes anyway, and then tell those stories. Like, I just, is it just me, or does it feel like there's a missed opportunity here to, you've set up these things that happen in the future, why not just move your stories into that future? Like, let's go already.
That's Chris. That's what actually, Chris, you touched on an idea that I was just going to say to Joe and Jack. Is like, couldn't they just Star Trek Discovery the Legion at this point?
I mean,
Right.
yes. So Chris, to your point, they actually tried that. There was, and to your point, there. So there's
They did. I had no idea.
Yeah. So there was the original continuity, then there was the rebooted continuity, then there was what they called the reboot, and then there was the post Infinite Crisis, and then the New 52, and then there's the Legion of Superheroes, as Joe indicated, that just wrapped up. And so one of the things that they tried to do is there was at some point, and I think the idea was they were just going to completely separate them from the previous continuity, and it was called 5 years later.
Oh yes, 5 years later.
Yeah,
That was Keith Giffen, right?
Yeah, exactly. And this was Keith Giffen writing, no, excuse me, it was Tom and Mary Birnbaum.
And Keith Giffen on the artwork, right?
Keith Giffen's on the artwork. And so basically they took the characters 5 years later. There was the Dominator invasions, and so the Dominators, that, as was seen on Arrowverse, were kind of introduced they may have actually been introduced in this particular series. I can't verify that for a fact, but the Dominators came and they ruled Earth, and so Earth was just kind of like a barren wasteland. So essentially, they made this. We're not even looking back; we're just moving forward, and so the Legion kind of existed as this ragtag bunch of rebels who wanted to adhere and hold on to the ideals of the Legion. Earth had been separated from the United Planets, and the other planets had their own things going on. So they were really going in the dark and gritty area. The fans didn't like it. And so this is always the problem. The fans completely did not like it, and so then they did this soft reboot where they essentially came up with a bunch of clones of the original Legion, and they were called the Batch SW6. So essentially, in that, they were basically trying to say, to the point where they actually destroyed the planet Earth. Earth was destroyed. But again, they run into the same problem I think many people run into if you maintain a legacy name and you don't truly stick to the convictions of your cojones, you're gonna fall back to nostalgia. You don't want to alienate your past readers, and you're gonna do something to pacify them. And so then at that point, the book became so watered down and muted. And so then the only option that they had then is, look, we're just going to start over again. And so I agree with you. I think on one level, the premise was sound for many years. And I think the idea fundamentally still works. But I think on some level, you would do best to really kind of divorce yourself from the past in a way that makes perfect sense. And I think Star Trek is very prominent in this discussion. I think very similar to what they did with Star Trek Discovery, insofar as, they essentially leapfrogged them into the future. Not only did they leapfrog them into the future, they basically said time travel is illegal. So they can never, they want to ensure that you don't have this whole notion, we're going to go back and forth, people from the past are going to come to the future, or we're going to go back. No, they basically, we leapfrog you, and this is it. This is where you are, and this is where you live. And that's what it's based on. And DC, whether it's the powers that be at Warner Brothers, DC has just never felt, or there's never been an editorial team or writer willing to actually make that level of a separation.
Well, I guess at this point, given our state of the comic book industry conversations, the future of any of these characters and books is up for grabs, right, Joe?
Oh, that's true words were never spoken, James.
I mean, anybody is on the chopping block, and it's all fair game at this point.
Yeah. Oh, that's very true. I mean, the Legion series, I mentioned previously, the Justice League versus Legion, I'm not reading, but before that, there was a 12-issue Legion series set 1,000 years in the future, written by Brian Michael Bendis, and it did terribly because, and while he did introduce some aspects into this future world that weren't perfect, that weren't gleaming, there's problems, there's the whole Gotham City thing that was introduced with in the future. He spent most of his time just having way too many Legionnaires in the book, first of all, and just them sitting around and just having these like cutesy teenage futuristic dialogues, and there was very little action and very little nuance, and it just didn't work. So I don't know if they're going to bring this group back. I have not read about anything about that recently. I think the JSA has got a better chance of coming back than the Legion right now. I don't know. I mean, I've got my 60 years worth of Legion books I can reread, and I'm doing that. And I've got my entire collection except for 247. So I'm okay.
Well, I mean, before we wrap up this episode, and we don't want to end on a sad note.
No, I've got a couple of great recommendations.
So yes, that's what I was going to say. For you and Jack, what are, aside from, I guess, the Great Darkness saga, what are some of Legion's, I guess, storylines that people can try to seek out either in trade form or just in, individual book form? What should people go and try to read?
Go ahead, Jack.
So I think that's a great question. Obviously, I think you should definitely start with the Great Darkness Saga. It's just an introduction. If you want to see the best that they have to offer, I think that's amazing.
Couldn't agree more.
Additionally, I think the early issues, although some would say dated, they hold up really well because they tie in very well with time and with Superboy, and it really does kind of create an optimistic, hopeful future as an idea. Another run that was really good, and I don't remember if it was consistent, but I know it was definitely one issue, was Who Shot Laurel Kent? I thought that was an amazing story because it introduced all of these other ideas that we had never thought about. And so in the course of Who Shot Laurel Kent was the home. So Clark Kent, spoiler, Superman's secret, alter ego, has a descendant.
Whoa, hey, come on now. People came here to hear about Legion, not, man.
I know. Not a secret anymore.
Like you said, this is, for those who are joining us late, this is the Superman edition of Secret Origins of Mint Condition. So by 1,000 years in the future, there's this idea that Clark Kent has a descendant, and she only inherited one power. And that is invulnerability.
Invulnerability, right.
And so obviously she has the Legion flight ring, so she can fly, but that's her only power is invulnerability. And so there's this mystery as to who shot Laurel Kent with a kryptonite bullet. And the thing I love about it, it's straight up, crime noir, detective mystery. And then you find out in the course of the issue that Shrinking Violet isn't Shrinking Violet. She's actually a Durlin. So she's from Chameleon Boy's race. And so she's a shapeshifter. But at this point, she had started a relationship with Colossal Boy. I mean, this thing is, it's a telenovela. But
it's true.
so good. I mean, that's the point. It is so good because it gives you just a little bit of everything in there that I couldn't help but just love it. And again, although I would recommend the 5 years later. It took me a while to get into it because again, it's such a clear break from what I knew from the Legion as I was growing up. But I mean, Chris, to your point, they take the stories in whole new directions. Characters do things which are uncharacteristic. And so it really allows the characters to grow in an organic way without necessarily having to be bound by the long history that they have. And so if you have an opportunity, anyone, to read, the 5 years later run, I would definitely recommend doing that because in many ways, I feel it truly made the Legion of Superheroes into adults.
That's great. Thank you, Jack.
Yes, they did grow up. Yes.
I'll make some just for our Hoopla, our sponsor or non-sponsor. I'm looking at it right now. They have the Great Darkness Saga is on Hoopla, and let's see here. I think that's the only one I can see right now that you guys just mentioned. Right
I have one that you can check, James. The one I'm going to recommend is the only good book that came out of what I consider the worst mega event in the history of the entire world's literature, Final Crisis. That I hate that thing. I despise it with a passion more than the Red Sox. So, but in that terrible storyline,
those are them some fighting words right there, Joe.
I mean, you get Keith and I to talk about Final Crisis, and you will hear venom spewed like you've never heard it before. In the Final Crisis, George Perez, Jeff Johns, and Scott Koblish did Legion of Three Worlds, where what Jack has been talking about for the past hour, different iterations and some good, some bad. Jeff Johns and George Perez just try to merge all these different iterations together and make it make sense. And it actually does. Even if you're not well-versed in Legion lore and you may get lost along the way somewhere in the book, the artwork alone, I'm paging through it right now, is spectacular. It's George Perez at his best. And previously, Perez had only done covers for the Legion of Superheroes back in the early 80s when they had DC had him doing covers. And you'd open up the book and it was Jimmy Jane's artwork or something what that guy's name was. It was terrible. So I would recommend, I don't know if it's on our sponsor, James, but Final Crisis, Legion of Three Worlds. I don't know where you can find these folks. I know they are in omnibuses. In the Silver Age, there's 3 Silver Age Legion omnibuses, and I have them all myself, but I also have the original copies, except for that 247. And in there are some of the best Legion stories, including my favorite, which we talked about when we did our 10 favorite comic book storylines, and that's the Adventure Comics 369 and 370, which is the first appearance of Mordru. And I have a question for you, Jack.
Oh, I think it's in this. They have Hoopla does have Legion of Superheroes, the Silver Age, Volume 1.
Yeah, I would recommend the stories that are written by Jim Shooter and penciled by Kurt Swan. But Jack, I have a question for you. Mordru, right?
Yes.
Is he? Who is the arch enemy of the Legion of Superheroes? Is it the Time Trapper or is it Mordru?
Wow, that's an excellent question.
I heard we were doing this today, so I have to ask Jack this question.
Yeah, so I've read such great stories with both of them. Right. I would probably say it's Mordru because
that's why I think it is too.
There was one instance where the Time Trapper actually went against Mordru to try to help either preserve or create the Legion of Superheroes, and so they handle his character very similar to Kang insofar as with all the convergent timelines. In some of them, I'm your enemy, but in some of them, I'm actually your friend and your ally. And I essentially almost have to play both roles to ensure my existence and yours. Otherwise, I don't exist. So definitely Mordru. And there were some great Mordru situations. There was Mordru, the stories with the White Witch, I think, were just amazing and compelling. Yes. And I mean, they have done some things that were just so astronomical. But again, lamenting to our earlier point, the stories were so insular. There was such inefficient world building. No one ever read them.
Well, as James said, those omnibuses are on the app, James?
The Volume 1 Silver Age omnibus is on there.
Yeah, well...
the Great Darkness Saga is on there. Legion Lost is on there.
Yeah, Legion Lost, you talked about that before. That was a great series. Great series.
And there are, I think, more of the recent Legion books are on here. They have Legion of Superheroes, The Curse is on here. I don't know if you guys have heard about or read that, But anyway, they have some of the more modern stuff, which you guys seem lukewarm on. But they have the Silver Age and they have the Great Darkness sagas on there for people to check out.
Check out the Silver Age Legion stories. They're Silver Age, so they're going to be a little dopey. You have to check your brain at the door. But
They also have Before the Darkness, the trade paperback of that, which I guess leads up to.
There's quite a build up to the Great. I have the hardcover here with me, and there's more than just the four, issues 290 to 294 in here. There's a quite a big build up in that book. So highly recommend that book. But yes, the Silver Age stuff, it can be dopey at times, like all Silver Age comics can be, but they're a lot of fun. They're a lot of fun to read, so I would recommend that.
Well, this is great. I learned a lot, and I got some recommendations to dig into. So I'll be checking these out from Hoopla and reading them. Though some of these are
here. And thanks, Joe and Jack, for being our resident experts there and answering our questions. Much obliged.
Welcome.
Yes, please. Yeah, this is great. Great to get a new aspect on characters that I've only heard of peripherally and read peripherally. So now to dive into some of their deeper works and get to know them better has been great. So I guess we will wrap this up as we always do with recommendations. Jack, I know you know the show, so hopefully you came prepared. So I'm gonna give it to you. Do you have any recommendations aside from the books that we've already talked about Legion-wise that you would want people to check out?
Sure. So this one's hot off the presses. I would recommend Jurassic World Dominion. Just saw it yesterday.
Really? Interesting. Okay.
Yes. So for those of you, it's one of those weird and interesting things because obviously this is no spoiler, but the original cast from the first one are coming back. The script is handled masterfully. They are actually able to balance the new cast from the Jurassic World series and the old cast from the Jurassic Park series and give them both equally enough fun and interesting things to do. And so even if you perhaps have kind of fallen out of favor with the franchise, I would say this is a wonderful capstone to the entire property. I don't think you'll be disappointed.
Oh, that sounds good. I got
that sounds great. Yeah, no. I'm like one of our recent episodes. I talked about Jurassic World: Fallen Kingdom and how I liked it because I knew what it was when I was going into it, so I enjoyed it. So I look forward to completing the Jurassic Park/World saga when I'm able to watch that. Chris, you have anything recommendation wise for this week?
No, a lot of my reading recently has been sort of like work related. So I'm still plugging away at 1602 by Neil Gaiman. So I'm a minute away from finishing that, and by a minute I mean I'm maybe a quarter of the way through. So super slow on that. And watching, I am looking forward to wrapping up Kenobi next week. And I've seen one episode of Ms. Marvel, and I'm really enjoying it. The second one has dropped. I just haven't gotten to it yet. So I'd say right now, things I'd recommend are sort of things that I've already recommended. So Obi-Wan Kenobi, Ms. Marvel, and I've started rewatching the second season of The Expanse in preparation for our next Expanse episode. So I guess those are my recommendations, or kind of standing recommendations.
Very good. Well, the standing recommendations are always good, so I appreciate you always bringing them back up. Joe, what do you have good for this week? Any recommendations?
I have something to recommend that ties into our Michael Jan Friedman interview. So, folks, if you haven't checked that out,
terrific!
Please do. It was excellent. James did a fantastic job. Chris was not present physically, but he had some great questions that we posed to Michael.
It makes it easier for me to get a good grade when I'm not in class.
Yeah, there you go. So it's an excellent episode. I think you'll enjoy it. Michael Jan Friedman has written, if you know his work, he's written many Star Trek novels. My Brother's Keeper is a trilogy that he penned. I guess it was about 20 years ago. And I just got the first copy a few days ago and started reading it. It's basically the story of a great friendship, the beginning of a great friendship that ends in tragedy, because it's the story of Jim Kirk's friendship with Gary Mitchell. And if you're familiar with the second Star Trek pilot, Where No Man Has Gone Before, you'll know what I'm talking about. So I would highly recommend My Brother's Keeper. All three. I haven't read the second and third part, but the first part is great. So I think it's going to pull through and go all the way through to being a great trilogy. So that's what I would recommend.
That's great, Joe. Yeah, Michael was on another podcast like the same week we dropped ours, and he had been talking about that series on that podcast. So I'm interested in reading that as well. I have two reading recommendations. I mean, I will stand with Chris in terms of his standing stuff. I'd recommend watching Kenobi, Miss Marvel. I've been enjoying The Expanse season 2. I am obviously watching it for the first time in preparation for our episode, and season 2 really drew me in, and I'm almost torn between watching the new stuff like Kenobi and Strange New Worlds because I kind of want to know what happens on The Expanse. in terms of reading recommendations, I recently read Strange Academy, Volume 1. I really enjoyed that. It's who's writing this? This is written by Scotty Young and it has
Scotty
art by
Young, yeah.
Umberto Ramos, and I really enjoyed it. It's a school for magic, so if you like that, it's like young magicians in the Marvel universe, and Doctor Strange is set up this academy to teach them to do battle with the evil forces that are coming up. So that is good. I also read this other book, and I actually got this book because the Hoopla had like all the Eisner Award nominees for 2021. So I picked up this book called The Good Asian by I hope I don't even think I can say their names correctly of the author, so I'm not going to butcher the names. But the book is called The Good Asian. It takes place in like 1925. It deals with an Asian, a Chinese detective who is on the police force during the ban on Chinese immigrants in America. And it basically just goes into Chinese immigration back then and how they were viewed as second-class citizens and the racial divides back then. And he is a guy who ends up on the police force because a rich man took him in as a child and he had some clout and power. And so that's why he is not discriminated against and gets to be a police officer. And it's a detective noir story set in this backdrop of discrimination and immigration ban. And it's the first volume of this, so it keeps going on. And the back part of the book, the last like 10 pages, actually outline all the immigration laws and against Asians and against other, outside races and genders of the time. So it's a good history lesson, but it's also a well-read book. So I recommend checking that out. It's definitely worth the nomination, and it should win, hopefully, the Eisner Award. Chris, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, I actually do have one thing that I want to recommend because as of recording this, it is Thursday, June 16th, and unfortunately, news had broken, I guess, that Tim Sale's been hospitalized with really severe health issues, which is really unfortunate. They have not specified beyond that, but if they bothered posting on social media about being hospitalized with severe health issues, that sounds like a big deal. So so I would absolutely recommend going back and looking at some of what I think of Tim Sale's best work, which would be the Color series. For me, that means, Daredevil Yellow and Spider-Man Blue especially, but, he also worked on Captain America White and Hulk Gray. And then The Long Halloween and Dark Victory are really terrific.
And Chris, Superman for All Seasons.
And Superman for All Seasons. Yeah. Superman for All Seasons is a really, really good one. So yeah, go find something by Tim Sale and send him some good thoughts.
Yes. Thank you, Chris.
And Daredevil Yellow too, right? Daredevil Yellow.
Yeah, Daredevil Yellow and Spider-Man Blue I mentioned are I think Daredevil Yellow is probably my favorite quote unquote Marvel color book. But Spider-Man Blue is right up there with Daredevil Yellow.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, thank you, Chris. I'm not sure when this episode is going to come out, folks, but hopefully Tim will know more about him by the time this episode drops. But checking out those books is always a good thing. Those are like in our Hoopla recommendation or standing recommendations for people who want to read good books. Those would always be on the list as well. So, we thank you for listening. Of course, I couldn't do this episode without our great guest, Jack.
Thank you so much. This is my pleasure, again, to talk about something that I truly love. And I think from the past episodes, Legion is kind of part of my secret, my mint condition history as well. Having purchased the Legion flight ring from Richie, that really kind of indoctrinated me into the whole mint condition family. So thank you.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, good callback all the way to your origin story, Jack. I appreciate you wrapping it all around, just like a good writer should. And of course, I couldn't do these episodes without my two stellar co-hosts. So thank you, Chris.
Always happy to be here, and especially on an episode where we get to share some time and conversation with Jack.
Yes, of course. And Joe, thank you.
All I can say is I wish my flight ring worked. but it's because I would fly to you guys and we could sit down and have a beer somewhere or just shoot the breeze face to face. But it's always a pleasure.
One day we'll do this in person, the recording. So hopefully for those days in the future. And listening audience, thank you as always. We would love to hear from you. We are back on asking questions and wanting to hear from you and answering them on the air. So please go to the Facebook page, Secret Origins of Mint Condition. If you don't want to leave something on the Facebook page, you can reach us in email, secretoriginsmc@gmail.com. And also Secret Origins of Mint Condition. We're on Instagram, so you can comment on postings there, or you can direct message me and we can talk about whatever you want to talk about on the air. We thank you for listening, and we will talk to you on the next episode.